And Aaron, there's a lot of things that you do in the world. You're a professor, you're art curator, you're a critic, you're a writer. You do so many things. But who is Aaron Rosen to Aaron Rosen?
Well, I try not to think about myself that much. I mean, most of life is trying to create a certain veil of silence so one doesn't have to think about one's internal self, right? Um, but yes, I mean, I think the core things about me and my identity are actually pretty eternal. It's just that, of course, like most people, it just took me a while to realize them. So I think I've always been a writer, but I understand that term differently over the years. I was much more of an academic writer, and I think now I can sort of switch into that key. But I also think myself as a children's book writer,
Hmm.
a popular theologian, an art critic. So there's these kind of different voices, but not in a not in an I hear voices sort of way. And I've always been a curator, but I even thought of that as a career when I was younger, and and so that's something that's come to me sort of later in life as I realized I would have all these relationships with artists, and I would love thinking about their creative process with them, and I'd even love the aspects of putting things around the room and figuring out where to place works of art, and then eventually placing them in public spaces, placing them in churches, cathedrals, and the like. And then I realized, oh no, that's what a curator is. I am a curator, and I've been curating absolutely everything about my life. Although that sounds a little millennial because these days people always talk about, oh, I'm going to curate my palette, I'm going to curate my
Mm.
dinner or whatever. So yeah, now everyone's a curator.
I mean, even when the church that I was a part of in Minneapolis, like the titles, the job titles were really like kind of millennials like that, where it's
Yeah.
like curator of faith formation or something along those lines.
Oh,
And
and everything is a
so, oh yeah,
bespoke experience. That's also crucial.
that's
Yes.
right.
Yeah.
That's right. You're speaking my millennial. You're speaking my millennial heart. Let's talk about a little bit about the book. This is not your first book by any means. You've certainly read, or you've written a few books. You've certainly read a few books, I'm sure, but you've certainly written a few books as well. What did you learn about yourself in the writing process of this book that maybe you didn't know about yourself before?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I mean, I mean, I like to think that, you learn something about yourself in every book. And now, I mean, these days, I tend to think of everything as some sort of form of autobiography. It's just various
Mm,
levels of disguise. So I even think my first book, Imagining Jewish Art, I was really just trying to figure out what it meant to be a Jew, who had grown up in rural Maine, moved to England, and um, was trying to figure out what it means to be a Jew in that case, at a distance from a lot of traditions, and at a distance from a lot of other Jews, and trying to think about how I constructed my Jewishness, and I had all sorts of ornate devices to figure that out, largely through modern painting. So with this book, I think I mean, it comes back to an interreligious background and also an interreligious life that I lead, and so it was really making sense of a lot of things that my um, think about my mother, who is Christian, to out myself. I'm a Jew. I see myself as a practicing
mhm.
Jew, but by the definitions of orthodoxy, a little problematic since my mother's a Christian, my father's Jewish, and I've always identified as Jewish. Um, and I'm now married to an Episcopal priest, and my son is Jewish, so we're continuing on this patrilineal line
Mhm.
of problematic Jews. And so this book was an opportunity to not be afraid of touching that Christian element of my history or of my life, and thinking about it from an explicitly interfaith Jewish perspective of mine.
Mhm.
And so it was really a great chance to test myself. But even now, I have just a slight antsiness about it, because it's like you take a book and you're like, oh, have you read this book about Jesus? Have you read this book about Jesus? So I can't help but feel a little strange, handing it out or doing signings and wanting to like bracket everything of what kind of Jew I am, and making sure
Mhm.
everyone understands that I really still see myself as a Jew. So I'm
Mhm.
hardly the first person. Jews have actually been obsessed with Jesus for a long time, and of course there's many brilliant books by Jewish theologians, and Jewish historians and cultural historians about Jesus. So I'm in that sort of lineage of Jews who have been drawn to this flame. but it still makes me a little nervous from time to time.
Totally, I can imagine that. Is there anything that you learned maybe about the Bible, about Jesus, even maybe about, like, art, or, something else, but was there something more kind of, like, factual or theological that you learned, as you were researching for this book that you were like, "Oh, that's a nugget that I need to put in, and I didn't know about that before?"
Yeah, I think, of course, in my PhD at Cambridge and other places, there's times when I've read selections in the New Testament very closely, but I think this was one of the first times that I just insisted that I would read things steadily through, and that I'd really just try to live a little more immersed in the rhythms of the Gospels. I mean, I have this curious life with my wife being a priest. That every Saturday night after Havdalah, we talk about her sermon on Sunday morning, so I'm always dipping in
Mm,
to Christian texts, especially via the Christian lectionary. But this was the first time of really wanting to spend a deeper amount of time sort of living with the Gospels to write the book. And I think one of the things that I loved and that I feel is still underappreciated is how strange and ironic and funny Jesus can be, and saucy even a little bit. And I think that's one of the things that I really found myself identifying with, is that he's interrupting sort of normative for his time patterns of thinking.
mm,
And I don't want to sort of fall into this trap of I think of a kind of millennial Christianity of like, Jesus, he's so cool and edgy. He was the original hipster. I
mm,
think I think that stuff is a bit lame. But on the other hand, I really felt a sense of the brilliance of Jesus's strangeness, and so I wanted to sort of bring that out
mm,
through the book.
mhm,
And of course, like most Jews reading the New Testament, and there's many more brilliant scholars that have done this. I was impressed by the studiousness of his Jewishness, even as that's problematic to the people writing the story and numerous
mm,
levels of reception. There's a Jewishness in there that's really fun to
mhm.
observe.
Mhm. I wanna talk about that later, but let's dive into the book right now. So, the way you begin the book is you talk about how Jesus understands vision. Obviously, the book being called What Would Jesus See?" A lot of this book is about vision, and so you talk about how Jesus understands vision at the beginning of the book. Can you talk a little bit about why vision is so important to Jesus and his ministry?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, we all live in visually saturated worlds, right? And
Mm.
and actually, we then just try to detach people in the past and think that they're somehow less visual than we are. Whereas actually, his world is, much more sensory and multi-sensory than ours in some ways, without screens. Um, and I think that Jesus needed to capture people's imagination and attention, and he needed to do that in a number of different ways. And part of it is, of course, his brilliance as a speaker, but even delivering the Beatitudes, there's a sense of being on a hill, or being viewed, being seen speaking as well, right? Not just speaking, but being seen to speak, or engaging with the woman accused of adultery, that he is wanting to set the stage for a particular thing that's happening, right?
Mm,
So he wants to draw in the sand. He wants to direct people's vision in all sorts of ways, and so he's using every tool at his disposal to do this. And in some cases, he's a bit theatrical, or he's a kind of performance artist. And it's
mhm,
just that we're not always comfortable seeing Jesus that way. There's a kind of presumption that it would be almost demeaning to think of him, hamming it up to the crowd, or utilizing their energies in particular ways and choreographing what he's doing. But he oftentimes goes out of his way to be choreographic. That's part of the messaging, is that it's physicalized in that way. And he's really proximate to people, to much sometimes in a way that I think flusters him and causes him to need a sense of remove. I talk about this in the book a bit, that he needs to go up to mountains to pray in the dark, and people have to come and fetch him because he's so overstimulated in his senses. So he needs this. He needs to refocus his vision. So he's living a very messy sensorial life, and vision is inextricable from that at every different level.
Mhm. Yeah, there's something so interesting about thinking about Jesus in that way where it's just there is I think a lot of times we miss it because what we have of Jesus is just words, right? The stories are very word centric, and then obviously we hear it orally, but it would be, and that's why like some of the like kind of visual adaptations that we've seen of the Gospels there's a lot of creative freedom that has to be made, and it's just really interesting, like some of the choices that are made for those visual representations
Oh yeah.
or adaptations. But it really is interesting to like think of Jesus in this visual way, even to the point where like you see like the classic like white Jesus, but and then I forget how many years ago, but there was that depiction of what Jesus likely looked like, given
Mhm.
him being like first century Palestinian Jew, and what we might know about what they would have looked like, and it's just like it's so jarring to like, oh, like visually this is even what Jesus would have looked like. And so just that whole visual aspect, that added context to these gospels, to Jesus, is so interesting. And I don't know, I just find it very, very
Yeah,
fascinating.
and in some ways, this is one of the very kind blurbs on the back of my book is written by my friend Joan Taylor, who wrote a book. What did Jesus look like? That's the question she was exploring, and so she was kind of so in a way, these are the kind of bookends. What would Jesus see, and how would Jesus be seen? What did he look
Mm,
like?
mhm,
And so she kind of digs into these questions in really interesting ways, and also the fact that there's so little external record outside of the New Testament and other texts that didn't make it into the canon about these visual questions, and so
mhm,
much was up for grabs very early on. And so of course, it's just not surprising that some people depicted Jesus as a Greek philosopher, some depicted him as a more of a mythic hero, or so he'll show up as being Apollonian, for instance. So
mhm,
so
mhm,
everyone had things that they were trying to read into the visage of Jesus.
mhm,
And at the same time, I mean, I wanted to set myself a question which I felt was answerable and unanswerable, which is I really wanted to enjoy the conjecture of how would this way of seeing that Jesus had transport and elegantly or not into the present. What might this worldview that he brings is so unique have to say to
mhm,
our present moment? And so it was both sort of inhabiting that, so to speak, original sense of how Jesus might have seen his world, but then taking that forward in another
mhm,
way. So it's really kind of a theological thought experiment. But to your point about what did Jesus look like? Yeah, I mean, I thought about that a lot the other day when I was in Atlanta at Ebenezer Baptist Church as a cradle of
mhm,
the civil rights movement, and thinking about the images of Jesus that are present there, and thinking um, uh, about that legacy and how much revisioning needed to happen when it comes to Jesus.
mhm. Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned just really briefly about taking this question of what would Jesus see and bringing it into our context, and that really kind of brings it full circle. Of obviously, the title of the book is this sort of play on the "what would Jesus do" phrase that became really popular.
Mhm.
Especially, I grew up as an evangelical kid, so I had the WWJD bracelets and shirts and all the things, right? And but the point of that question was not just what did Jesus do in the Bible, but the point of that question is what would Jesus do, and how are you going to do what Jesus would do in your current context? And so I
Mhm.
like that you're kind of using that phrase in that same way, where it's like not only did what did Jesus see in the Bible, but what would Jesus see now if he were here, and how does that actually, how should that affect us in our lives now?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, of course, I'm absolutely channeling that phraseology very consciously. When I was debating the book title with my publisher, at one point they had a meeting and for marketing and said, I don't know, it doesn't feel very of the moment, and it feels possibly a bit too evangelical. And I thought, too evangelical? Do you know who I am? Like that's like I've been called many things, but an evangelical Christian is definitely not one of them. And so I had found myself really having to argue for and I think they offered lots of wonderful pushback, but have to argue for this title of what would Jesus see? And we even debated about whether or not we should have a question mark. They thought maybe the question mark was a little bit too much. And I was like, no, I really think
Mhm.
it is a question. We need the question mark for what would Jesus see? And because I wanted to be uncertain. But one of the things that I dig into a little bit in the introduction of the book is that what the WWJD crowd, it's a great question, and one that's recurred in different ways throughout Christian history. But the problem is that too many people thought they knew, so there really just wasn't a good question mark at the end. It was, what would Jesus do? Oh, I know, he would be a literalist interpreting himself. You're like, no, probably not. Probably the opposite, actually. And so a lot of the sort of revolutionary spark of Jesus actually got lost in what is and can be a very radical question. So
Mhm.
I wanted to sort of harness what I think are the best elements of that with this. What would Jesus see?
Right. So you open up the book talking about, what, how Jesus understood vision and, obviously what would Jesus see. You also talk about how others see Jesus.
Mhm.
And obviously, given Jesus's context, he was mostly seen by other early Jews during that time, during his ministry. So, given that context, how do others see Jesus, or how would have others seen Jesus?
Oh, I mean, I think there's better scholars on this than me, and I've been clear in the book that I don't want to do a historical Jesus analysis, but to give
Right.
it just sort of a rough take. I think I think people. I mean, he was seen in the company of other people delivering apocalyptic visions and bold visions of the future with elements of political agitation. And I think so many of the books that have come out in the last 50 to 70 years have, every generation has picked up, and signal scholars have picked up on different elements of Jesus, with it, similarities to other political movements in first century Palestine. I mean, I think actually Monty Python, captures it in the life of Brian pretty well. Is that there was all sorts of different factions and different way, and first century Palestine was a complete mess. And
Mhm.
Jesus both stood out for the beauty and the strangeness of his vision, and yet on the other hand, was one of many people preaching a radical vision and contesting what the future of Judaism would look like.
Mhm.
And trying to position himself in a world that's, of course, at that time defined by the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, these different groups with different visions of of what Judaism should be.
Mhm.
So everything was in flux in that period.
Mhm.
And so I don't think, I'm not even sure Jesus knew how to think about himself. So how
Mhm.
do we know what what other people saw in him, right? And I think one of the imaginative records that we've had of, the last temptation of Christ and sort of different visionings of Jesus, I think get to this sense of strangeness in his own self-conception.
Mhm. Well, yeah, I mean, even the fact that we have 4 canonical gospels that are all, presenting a very different Jesus, clearly people were seeing Jesus very differently. So, the question that Jesus often gets of, "Who am I?" And, him asking his disciples who he is, and a lot of
Mm.
times they get it wrong. And I kinda wonder, like, well, it clearly, like, everybody seems to be getting, like, at least a part of Jesus wrong, because there were so many different understandings of who this guy was, and so clearly people saw him very differently depending on who you were.
Yes, and I like that you bring up this sense of him asking, right? Because on the way, there's so many different ways to see that, and we often see it through the prism of later Christology, when ideas about Jesus's divinity or personhood had had been decided, and then eisegetically we read that back in and assume that he's doing things with the kind of clarity of conception that comes from later Christian theology. And sometimes you get the sense that he's like, no, really, guys, tell me, who am I? Right? That there, that he's almost aware that he has these shadows of other identities, and that they're not, they're both wrong and right in different ways, right?
Mhm.
And so seeing him, he's able to see himself typologically in a line of other prophets, to see his affinity to Moses or to Elijah, and to see, and at the same time to see himself as the Son of Man at times. And so I think I think he's going through these questions, and I think it's productively indeterminate. But of course, we as readers and especially believers want to isolate and determine those things for him.
Mhm. I think it was, like, sometime somewhere in the middle of the book, but you talk a little bit about what Jesus asks of his followers, and I think you even might have used, like, the word demands, like, what Jesus, like, demanded of his followers. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Hmm. Yeah, I'm trying to think the middle. I mean, I haven't read the middle of it in a
Yeah,
long time. Let's see.
let me where did I write that note down? Let me see it really quick, but yeah, there was somewhere it was, like, maybe chapter 2 or chapter 3, somewhere around
Yeah.
there.
I mean, I think I think there's all sorts of demands that he makes of people, and I think one is, the one that I talk about a lot is this idea of recognizing others, and that he has a really strong, uh, call for what that is, that we need to see people in a kind of a fullness. I mean, in the way that he sees other people. So he's always setting standards for them that they can't meet, right? And in
Mm.
fact, I mean, as many people have pointed out, the disciples can be fairly schmucky at times, right? That's part of their gift as literary characters, but it's also part of what makes them approachable and allows people to see themselves within the New Testament narratives,
Mhm.
because they are not these elevated, intellectuals, or even morally all that elevated. Actually, Jesus
Mhm.
elevates them, and he utilizes their moral and intellectual frailty. So I think that. Jesus is calling them to try to see others the way that he sees them, and that's one of the things that I really enjoyed writing about, is what this calling narrative is. When he calls disciples, he will. I mean, I sort of compare it to a pickup basketball team. That it's like, I'll take you. You look tall, I'll take you. You could play point, you'll take you. And it's really just who's there at the playground. I mean, it's
Mhm.
not like he's not collecting references. There's nothing particular that that we can see him seeing in someone else. They're just, but he sees him with this depth of
Mhm.
their humanity. And so being seen in that way, and that certainly comes out with the story of Matthew. To be seen in that way, then is issues forth from it a demand to see others in a similar way, if one can.
Mhm.
But again, he expects and knows they will fail at all of these things.
Right. It is interesting you bring up that point about the disciples being this literary element where the reader can identify with. Like, I mean, really, I've never really thought about the disciples in that way, but, like, these 12 disciples are really people that in a variety of different ways, you're like, "Oh, that's me." Like, that's me in the story right there, and that is really interesting how Jesus is, how these stories are framed in such a way where, you feel like you're one of these people that Jesus is having a relationship with.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and I think that's their brilliance is literature. And actually, it's a brilliant genre to try to, which is not unakin to some experiments in modern literature, to try to tell the same story from slightly varied perspectives in these ways, and to twist things and recapitulate them at times, but just have slight little fissures that differentiate the stories when you read them, against one another. But I think I'm always drawn to those moments where there's ambiguity. I mean, you probably shouldn't, have favorites, but it's why I prefer the synoptics to John. I feel that
Mhm.
John is too solid. He knows too much. He's too convinced of everything that he's portraying. So
Mhm.
the story to me lacks some of the permeability that I look for in the other gospels.
Mhm.
But I think there's a gift that Christianity allows this kind of literary smorgasbord that you can identify strongly with not only with particular characters but ways of representing the same characters.
Mhm.
And so I mean I was always aware being married to a priest that I'm allowing myself a certain playfulness and toying with to me what are literary representations, but they have real implications for people, and I
Mhm.
always wanted to feel like I was writing things that brought out something in the text that would be useful to people that would have a different faith background than me.
Mhm.
So it was always this kind of balance of looking for irony and looking for humor. And I quote Bishop Christopher Stendhal on this, that the importance of humor in relationship to biblical studies, but also just a profound respect on the other hand.
You mentioned just a second ago about how you look at these stories as literature, but they have profound implications for our world. And I often think about there's always like this argument among like fundamentalist Christians about like biblical inspiration and all of that. I often think of inspiration in that way, and I've said before, like, we could, if tomorrow we found out Jesus actually never even existed, which is very unlikely, but if we find that out, I still think I would be a Christian because of because of this as literature and how it has changed my life and how I think it can change the world as well. When you were writing this book, and again, you're toying with these as literature, do you think through like biblical inspiration, even for like your own tradition as a Jew? Like, do you think through like the that dynamic of like how much of this needs to actually be historical, how much of it really needs to be just literary for these stories to be like inspiration for you and your faith.
Yeah, I don't think, uh, well, to use Jack Black in the School of Rock, one great rock show can change the future of the world. So I think, I believe very passionately in imaginative capacity, and I believe in it. I really do believe in it as being revelatory as well. And
Hmm.
and there's great thinkers that have explored this. From my dear friend Ben Quash to David Brown, another Anglican theologian, that taking seriously works of the imagination can reveal deep and profound things about God. And so I think, or really about ourselves. And so I think there's a truth value that doesn't ever have to be historical, but I'm very cognizant of that it does for other people.
Hmm.
And when I approach my own tradition as a Jew, I mean, when I uh, talk about the Passover story with my son or the Esther story at Purim, you know, uh, we emphasize the story, and we emphasize what we can find in it, but the veracity of that is not something I that's frankly all that important to me.
Hmm.
And actually, one of the things my son is doing a lot recently is he says, can you tell me a story about Haman? And I realized that, I mean, of course, the Jewish holiday calendar is really just about a bunch of attempted genocides that happen to us over and over again in different
Hmm.
ways. And so it's hard to tell these stories to kids. And then someone else tried to kill everyone because they were Jewish, and it's not a wonderful message, although frankly more and more relevant in this part of the 21st century.
Hmm.
Um, and so he'll say, "Tell me another story about Haman," and he's been really worried that uh, if Elijah can come back at Passover, then maybe the Pharaoh can come back as well and get little good Jewish boys, but also maybe Haman. So they live in his imagination in this really creative way, and
Hmm.
we've translated it that Haman's trying to steal all the chocolates from the Jews, and he has to learn his lesson and go into timeout and get better at sharing with Jews. This is kind of our rendition of this, and in even the fanciful silliness of this whole exercise with him makes me appreciate how we continually evolve the stories in our minds, and we're always trying to triangulate to what we think are the messages that are most core in that, right? In
Mhm.
terms of what does respect mean in a vocabulary for a newly minted 5-year-old, right?
Mhm.
And so I've always been interested in the imaginative record in terms of modern and contemporary high-end art, but here I find myself as a parent engaging with story in a different way.
Mm.
And so, yeah, it's what anchors that for people. Where do they need to have, again, that sort of belief that imagination does certain things and reveals certain things, or do they need to believe that there's a historical kernel upon
Mhm.
which things are based? And
Mhm.
I wouldn't want to judge the either end of that.
Right, right. Your chapter about how Jesus understands true and false appearances was really interesting to me.
Oh.
For listeners who haven't read the book yet, but want a little sneak peek, what do you mean by true and false appearances, and how does Jesus understand them, and what do they have
Mm.
to teach us in our time?
Gosh, yeah. I mean, this was so much to delve into as a writer. I was actually a little bit scared of writing that chapter. I think truth and falsity in a number of different ways. One is that I wanted to play with the idea of what it means to be an eyewitness,
Mm,
because the Gospels are oftentimes insisting that someone saw something very directly, or this was seen, and then this was reported to this person who gave a faithful record of it to this person. And of course, we know that that's not a great standard of evidence in the contemporary courtroom, and actually opens the floodgates to prejudice. We think about the terrifying numbers of people of color that have been convicted on quote unquote eyewitness testimony,
mm,
right?
mhm,
So on the one hand, I think I wanted to figure out what could be salvaged in some ideas of witness, and think about I was thinking about this a little bit this morning, um, that Jesus' standard for determining truth or witnessing is not always doesn't work in all circumstances, um, but he really emphasizes personal conviction, and above all his own conviction of what he
mhm,
is seeing. Um, but I compare that in the book, and think about examples of witnessing in moments of historical trauma when all you can do is depend on your knowledge that what you're seeing is really happening, and that it must be seen by others, and that you have a critical role to transmit that. And so I relate that uh, some of the very few photographs that are taken by within the concentration camps at
mm,
Auschwitz. Just these couple little snapshots that are taken incognito. One from the sort of almost unimaginable from the mouth of the crematorium, and that this sort of heroic act of this witnessing,
mm,
has points of relationship. I don't want to draw too strong parallels, but it does points of relationship to thinking about the young woman who bravely captured the murder of George Floyd, and
mhm,
I mean wins a Pulitzer Prize, right? That there's something about knowing in a particular moment that you are seen on behalf of others,
mm,
and how crucial that act can be. And so I wanted to talk about those issues. And on the other hand, I wanted to talk a little bit about how uh, I have a little section in that chapter called "Invisible Ink." That how do we look? Jesus is always asking us to look deeper and interpret things at a more refined level that he can determine, and seeing behind the text or behind what seems to be going on is a brilliant call on the one hand, but on the other hand, how does that stop from becoming just brazen esotericism, or a kind of quasi mystical capacity? And you see this in QAnon, right? That of
mhm,
wanting to say, oh well, this is a signal of this. If you look at the number of letters, this proves this thing. And you're like, and so how do we not get caught up in that. And because I think that's idolatrous. I think by
Mhm.
Christian terminology, that QAnon aspect is idolatrous. And so, no, hopefully that won't impact your readers. I doubt there's very many, or listeners rather. But
I
um,
don't think you have to worry about QAnon in
yeah,
here.
I think we're probably pretty safe here, right? But so one of the things I say in the book is that Jesus invites us to read between the lines, but there's still lines, and
Mhm.
that's the important thing. And when trying to discern something that religiously might feel hermetic and only for your eyes only, to use a kind of James Bondism. And
Mhm.
so I was really interested in kind of exploring some of these kind of gray regions where truth and falsity um, uh, uh, get hard to determine.
Mhm.
And I think in our contemporary media culture, that's just harder and harder. So I point to the kind of signal moment for me, and I remember watching this on TV in Berkeley was the first episode of the Colbert Report when he talks about truthiness, right?
Mm.
And it's
Mhm.
just what a wonderful satire that is. And of course, actually, Colbert is a very religiously astute viewer, actually, of the contemporary world. Um, and that I think we are saturated in that moment of truthiness,
Mhm.
and it's only going to get worse with AI and other technology and disingenuous actors. And
Mhm.
um, so I think I was interested in using Jesus, who's oftentimes drawn into these conversations in the wrong way, trying to bring him in a different way and say,
Mm.
what kind of tools might he give us to discern truth and falsity?
Mhm. Yeah, I really appreciated that chapter for that reason, and especially you're connecting that to, like, the rise of, like, fake news and all of that. I really, really appreciated that, and to think of Jesus and again, those false and true appearances, to think about Jesus, in kind of those stories through that, like, the eyes or the context of, like, fake news, this truthiness, all of that. It's really, really interesting to think about it through all of that.
Yes, I think, yeah, it's a I mean, it's a terrifying cultural moment on the one hand, but I
Totally.
think I've always felt like one of the things I could do as a scholar is just in small ways kind of help rescue religion from its own adherence a little bit and remind people of the ethical beauty, the shimmering clarity at times of biblical texts. Um, uh, and remind people when to find that ambiguity that texts always mean more than we think they do in a particular cultural moment. And no doubt there's ways in which I've got this spectacularly wrong in my own book or in my
Mhm.
other books, but really trying to utilize the text to be more rigorous on ourselves.
Mhm. Jesus may be the most famous person in history, and
Mhm.
yet we don't know what he looked like. And we, touched on this a little bit, but if Jesus just came back right now, none of us would know that it's actually Jesus because we don't know what he looked like. And I think what's funny is that also in many of the stories, his own followers misrecognize him. Like they don't
Mm.
recognize him. And you talk a little bit about that in the book as well. Why is that important that even some of his own followers don't recognize him? Like, we don't recognize Jesus. I find that really funny and interesting,
Yeah,
and yeah.
I think that's one of the strangest stories and really one of the most problematic. So I loved that, of course. And um, and by the way, I mean, of course, Dostoevsky and others have sort of imagined this, and sometimes people imagine that everyone knows it's Jesus, but then in the Dostoevsky version, of course, the church wants to get rid of him. So you're not needed here. We've got it. Um, but yeah, when he comes, especially when he's resurrected, why is it that they wouldn't see him? And I really puzzled over this a lot, especially because it's such a famous incident in the history of art. And you have Titian's Noli Me Tangere, and you have Jesus in what I think describe or wish I had if I didn't describe as a kind of a skimpy outfit
Mm,
that Jesus is wearing, just a little a saucy little number, just a diaphanous little loincloth, basically, and a little cape. Is how is it that how is it that Magdalene doesn't see that this is the same guy from just a few days ago? Is their
mhm,
memory that short, right? So what is it that's happening there? Um, and I mean, there's all sorts of really interesting ways to think about this. And one is that um, uh, that Jesus is fundamentally changed by this experience, and in a way that uh, uh, yeah, changes his actual visage. The other way is that Jesus might be changed from, if we think from later Christian doctrine of the harrowing of hell, that Jesus might be changed by everything that has happened to him. This sort of fullness of all history and all time and all sin and everything that he's experienced in what in human time just represents a few days, right? So he's completely galactically changed in some profound way.
Mm.
Maybe he comes back with scrambled senses. So maybe he doesn't recognize her, and she's not used to not being recognized,
Mm.
and she doesn't understand why would this man be hiding if this really is Jesus? Why would he not be racing towards her and be thrilled to see her again? And so there can be misrecognition happening on both sides of this. But I mean, uh, I I sort of frame this with my own experience of after my sister Whitney passed, of seeing elements of her. I still do a little bit, but not as keenly as I did in those early years, of seeing elements of her, like, oh, these are her eyes, this is her hair, everything.
Mm.
If you glimpse people in an airport when you've lost someone, and maybe people feel this about people that they've just even broken up with. Maybe it doesn't have to be in death, but for me, this idea of just this desperation to see this person again, that you're
Mhm.
looking and looking for them, and yet Jesus's disciples and followers seem to be doing the opposite. They can't even see, they're seeing the actual person, and they're like, nah, it can't be him, right?
Right.
It seems ludicrous. Um, but I think it helps frame a really key thing, which is, when is a person still the same person? What
Mm.
is absolutely truly core to a person's identity, however much they may have changed. And so that's the kind of way I've wanted to kind of investigate that, of
Mhm.
through this misrecognition.
Mhm. Yeah, I have, like, a similar kind of experience in that regard of, I look similar to, what I did 10, 15 years ago, similar facial structure and all of that, but I think a lot of people who haven't known me for the last 10 years and how much I've changed politically and theologically and everything, I bet a
Mm,
lot of people would not recognize me anymore in that
right,
regard.
right.
They may physically recognize me, but they wouldn't recognize me. And I think that is common for a lot of people.
Right, and they would come to you with the same preconceptions about your identity, right? And I think
Mhm.
that's quite interesting as well. That people would say, uh, yeah, we expect people, and of course we know even a cellular level that that's not the case. But people, um, uh, we we expect everyone to remain the same, and we expect them to remain the same for our benefit, so that we have the comfort of knowing the stability of their identity, partly because that vouchsafes the constancy of our own identity, right? So
Mhm.
we want to see them the same way, so that we know we are seen in the same way sometimes.
Mhm.
Yeah, and so it's a simplicity and a complexity there. And I do love, what that brought up for you, because I think it's just that sense of uh how useful the gospels are for framing existential dilemmas. Now, we know in biblical scholarship that can be problematic. We can map things on that don't exist to the
Right.
to the text, and I love Stendhal's Paul among Jews and Gentiles for this reason, of that we have the existential conscience of the modern West that we map on and see in the gospels. But the
Mhm.
truth is, we always do that, and there is also value in that
Mhm.
interpolation as well.
Mhm, absolutely. With writing a book about what Jesus sees and obviously sight and vision being very central to this book, how do you navigate or how do you think through people who are sight impaired or blind? Like how do you think
Yeah.
through that? I would imagine that that's a question that's rolling around in your mind as you're writing a book about like this.
Yeah, I and that was a nervousness that I had. I think we've all had a reckoning with our own internal prejudices and preconceptions, or we hopefully we have in the last several years in particular, for a variety of reasons. And one thing that I was really uh, aware of as I was writing some of this book is that I didn't want to value sight in a way that was ableist and repeated what I see as the sort of moral tropes about seeing that are just omnipresent through the Gospels.
Mhm.
I mean, everything is about being blind and then seeing, and so the very idea of coming into awareness morally is always seen in a visual metaphor, right? And so I didn't want to repeat that. But at the same time, I wanted to kind of meet the text at where it is, and see what we could do with that kind of material. And so I think I think in particular of the story about Jesus and the man born blind, right? And
Mhm.
that the people around him think that um, he must be sinful, right? So at the very least, Jesus uh, is not apt to just sort of swallow this theological explanation. He gives one which also has its own problems, but he sends the man off, right, and he wants him to bathe in the pools of Siloam, and he wants him to rub his eyes with mud, and he wants to be there also at the first moment that this person sees. And so he's kind of guiding him through what it's like to come into sight. That and he said, they have this dialogue about who is this man? Who is Jesus? Well, he's the man
Mhm.
who's right in front of you, right? Because the man hasn't seen. How could he even make sense of the visual data that suddenly would be kind of flooding into his system?
Mhm.
And so I sort of imagine Jesus touches him and holds him and helps him create these kind of new neural pathways
Hmm.
to be able to understand seeing, because seeing is not just a visual act; it's an understanding. I think maybe if we pivot in that way and we think not just of sight in a narrow biological sense, but we think of seeing. And I was talking about this with a filmmaker friend of mine, Pete Tolton, last night, actually, sort of borderline experiences of seeing, of new sight, a third eye, all sorts of different on the margins of what we might consider to be seeing, right?
Mm.
And so maybe the thing to do in these kind of stories is to focus on what kind of awareness is being granted. What kind of
Mm.
How is Jesus utilizing the senses to tell a story about awareness, a recognition of truth, and undermining certain ideas of and prejudices about deficiency that exist at his time. He doesn't catch all of these because he's a first century Jew, so he's going to make real big mistakes by contemporary standards of prejudice, but he does, in that story, unwind at least some of the prejudices of his era.
Mhm. Mhm. With a book, that, obviously is focusing on what Jesus sees, it seems like and as you explore what Jesus sees, it seems like you really reveal this radical empathy, and I think that's sort of the terminology you use, of radical empathy that Jesus seems to demonstrate throughout these stories. Can you talk about what you mean by radical empathy? And what I really like is how you kind of wanna also shape it, like, how should this matter to us today? How radical empathy should matter to us today, and potentially even how it really should shape our politics.
Right. Yeah. I think, well, one of the things that I find most distressing, writing a book about Jesus in this time is that, you're also competing for airspace and time with people that are genuinely stupid and mean, like Lauren Boebert,
Mm,
and who think that they know everything about the Bible, and shockingly, they don't.
right.
Um, and so so it's really well, ask me the question again. I'm going to take a
Yeah.
slightly different angle on it, actually.
Yeah, so how do you understand radical empathy,
Yeah.
especially the radical empathy you think that Jesus is demonstrating here in these stories, and then how do you think it should shape our lives and even maybe especially our politics?
Yeah, I mean, so I gave an example there of someone a very unempathetic way of addressing someone I think doesn't show enough empathy. I think the key thing is to, as Saint Augustine said, is if we, and again, Augustine sometimes gets things really wrong, but that if we're not finding love in a biblical passage, we're probably reading it wrong. That
Mm,
there and so we need to coax the text to tell us the messages of love. Whereas actually, I think sometimes we come with these preconceptions of looking for a rationalization or justification for the opposite there. And so I wanted to emphasize in some cases that the way the Bible is being most utilized in contemporary politics in America is in questions of gender and sexuality, for instance.
mhm,
And so I did want to tackle um, what it means to truly see someone, and that's the kind of call that we have. I actually really like this in contemporary diction that a lot of people talk about, I feel seen, I want to be seen, and what does that mean? It actually comes back to the question you asked earlier about, how do we not that's not an ableist thing, right? It's not just about
mhm,
vision. That they want to be appreciated and recognized in a really deep way.
mhm,
And I think that's what Jesus is doing with his disciples. And I bring out the kind of calling narrative. What would be like to take that seriously in relationship to how people who were not trans, for instance, might perceive friends, lovers, colleagues, passersby that are trans,
mhm,
and that we're getting caught up in this language of uh, saying that someone should be identified with their biological sex, as if that itself is this kind of immutable God-given
right,
fact in some ways, which is so scientifically and theologically flawed in all these different ways. But I try to sort of enter into that debate in a more productive way and say the number one pronoun that Jesus is wanting us to use is the second person. He's wanting us to just identify someone as you. That he
mhm,
wants people to be able to, the core message. Jesus wouldn't have understood a lot of different elements of human sexuality as we see and appreciate it now. But he would have really understood this core message of his own of
mhm,
of seeing and identifying people for who they are in a way that makes them say, I feel seen, right?
mhm,
And the importance of elevating that. And so on the one hand, I use this kind of radical empathy as a phrase, just because I want to emphasize that there's a searing clarity to that. And yet at the same time, it's also really simple. It's not that, and I think radical ideas are oftentimes have searing clarity and simplicity to them. It's
mhm,
not that, again, having just been in Atlanta and seeing this examples of the placards that people carried that say, I am a man, right? Just the very basic level. I want to be seen in this way. Recognize me and
mhm,
my humanity. And to have to emphasize that is so tragic and so sad, but in those periods so absolutely essential. And so kind of recovering that
mhm,
rather than utilizing the Bible to find opportunities to not see people. And that's what I just find so abhorrent and so hard to watch as a scholar of religion and just as a person right now.
mhm. It reminds me of, a lot of times when we see, when these moments happen of, specifically, let's say, like a black man who's killed by the police, and a lot of times the images of these men are like they're trying to create a narrative of like this is, maybe they'll like have like a mugshot of that
Mhm.
man who was killed or whatever, rather than this person, than a photo of this person just, being a normal person or whatever.
Yeah.
And there's a reason why that narrative, or there's a reason why people are choosing one photo or the other of this person, because of how do we want to see this person. And again, I think what you're pulling out is it seems like Jesus would certainly be the kind of person of like, let's actually pull out like the real you and not this like characterization of, what you would see like in a mugshot.
Yeah, and I think, there's so many tropes, and the problem with images, that the very thing that makes them powerful and useful is this thing that makes them incredibly slippery and dangerous, because
Mhm.
they can seem to tell another story instantly in a counter narrative, and they can be used as evidence in ways that are just incredibly problematic. And I mentioned in the book the work of an artist I really like, Jared Thorne. And Jared has very thoughtfully asked permission from the families of murdered young black men murdered by police for the autopsy reports. And even in the autopsy, and then with light boxes, he'll reverse these. And so, but in just in the reversing of them from white diagrams that are sort of annotated to luminous black diagrams of the body,
Mm.
there's a reversal, right? And in a kind of a way of seeing things that seem to be just the dead body suffering stigmata, to maybe seeing someone as in ascent, a rising body.
Mm.
And but it's so telling that in this basic thing, that this last one of the last indignities that people suffer is that the torments that were meted out upon them, that the bullet wounds are being perceived to be on a white body as a normative foundational thing, that their bodies are departures from a white norm, even in
Mm.
the very diagrams of their autopsies, right? And so
Wow.
I think it showcases in this quite powerful, dramatic way all these preconceptions of sight, and and I think that's there's so many ways, and I just touched on some of them in the book, right? Of course, but there's so many ways in which the evils that we're doing to people at the present are visual errors and visual sins.
Mhm.
And it's I hope that I shed at least a little bit of light on some of these problems. And
Mhm.
again, it was something that I entered into with a lot of trepidation, because I think not all of these always feel like my own stories to tell, or they don't feel, but they feel very urgent. And it was just a sense of trying to get it as right as I could, to tackle all of these different cultural problems and debates, in which I think Jesus and ideas of sight have a role to play.
Mhm. Absolutely. The tagline of my podcast is exploring, inspiring, and liberating theology. So, how do you hope what Jesus would see inspires and liberates its readers?
Hmm. Um, well, I would say that it's funny reading what some people had written about the book, or what some people's response was. Said it was very optimistic, and I was thought, "Oh, that's nice." I never think of myself as optimistic. I always think of myself as incredibly cynical. But I think one of the funny things about writing is that sometimes, as a friend of mine says, that there's an intrinsic act of optimism in writing. And so I felt more optimistic having written the book, actually. And I think it's that, to come back to the idea, more of a ophthalmological metaphor, to be able to see more clearly, or to have kind of corrective surgery, that the ways we use seeing poorly and incorrectly, and in damaging ways, those can be reversed. And
Mm.
the same tools that got us in the wrong direction, we can return to those,
Mm.
and we can use them to see with fresh eyes. And so I hope that at the very least there's kind of a catalyst for people who read the book, to go back and see the text in new ways, things that they thought that they understood in a particular way. And that might be liberating, and they might also be liberating the text, right? I think that's the thing, is that the text becomes prisoner so oftentimes to our preconceptions, and we have to, in this hermeneutic circle, allow the text to be liberated, to liberate us again. And I think
Mhm.
that's one of the recurring ideas that animates me as a theologian.
Absolutely. Dr. Rosen, how can listeners get connected to you and your work, and where can they get the book?
Yes, the book is everywhere. I always prefer that everyone buys the book, even if it's used, even if I never see a dollar. Please buy from your local bookstores, order from your local bookstores. But if you must, then of course it's on Amazon, Bookshop. It's on every possible channel. It's out there. You can even write me, um, and there's lots of ways to reach me. One way is through my Instagram. I avoid Facebook as much as possible, and definitely avoid Twitter. And of course, it's a book on site, so Instagram is the most visual. So Parsonage Gallery, and I also run a gallery on the coast of Maine with my wife. One of the many things we do, but kind of an exploratory space to kind of test out a lot of the kind of ideas and things that I've played with in the book. So the Parsonage Gallery in Searsport, Maine, and you can look us up at parsonagegallery.org.
Perfect. Wonderful. Well, I love the book. It was absolutely incredible, and your perspective, it just like hearing your perspective, about these stories is just so, so cool. So thank you so much for chatting more about the book.
Oh, that's really kind. I really appreciate it. I don't take having anyone read anything I've written for granted.